As world leaders gather in Glasgow for the UN Climate Change Conference, Scotland's 5 centres of expertise have joined forces to highlight just how much their work helps to protect the people, land, nature and businesses of Scotland. The 5 centres draw upon the huge range and depth of expertise and research carried out by the Scottish Environment, Food and Agriculture Research Institutes, by our universities and other organisations across Scotland, including industry.
We are SEFARI Gateway, Scotland's Environment, Food, Agricultural Research Institutes. We're the knowledge exchange and impact hub for the Scottish Government Strategic Research Portfolio. Having mid to long-term research is absolutely vital to addressing the strategic challenges that we face from the climate emergency, from nature emergency, from issues around people's diets, to the strength of agriculture, of rural communities and the economy. The Islands Revival project was an online project that then became a physical project that brought island communities, development organisations working with those communities, together with researchers to look at their specific needs and their specific opportunities with their communities. The Islands Revival project enabled researchers to connect in a very immediate way with a huge body of understanding and knowledge and capacity within remote communities. So it's crucial in how we shape our research for those communities. An example of the raft of knowledge that is held in local communities could be on their housing needs, their transport needs, their connectivity, and their schooling, for example. Where communities have been able to share their experiences, their practices, what works for them, enabling communities to act locally, to develop things that will work for them. SEFARI Gateway commissioned a think tank for conserving genetic diversity. This is addressing a major issue, obviously driven through the climate emergency. So looking at conservation of genetic diversity involves some of Scotland's most iconic wild species, and that includes Scots pine, moorland heather, red deer, and of course the red squirrel. And one of the crucial advantages of taking a conservation of genetic diversity approach is that it can help nature to help itself. The aims and outcomes for the Genetic Diversity Project are to provide a toolkit to evaluate and target the conservation of genetic diversity. The initial scope for the project was focused to Scotland. However, it is UK-wide and has subsequently become global. And this has led in the UK to the setting up of the UK's first Genetic Diversity Conservation Unit at Wester Ross. One of the benefits from SEFARI Gateway is that we work in partnership and build partnerships with policy, with business, with communities to deliver research that benefits Scotland's land, Scotland's environment and Scotland's communities.
So climate change is the rise in temperature and the change in climate patterns that has been occurring over a very long period. And it's reached the point now where it's very obvious that it's actually a threat to the way we live. Climate Exchange is a centre of expertise on behalf of Scottish Government that focuses on things that we can do to help policymakers address climate change. And it works in 2 ways. It's a virtual centre that draws on research expertise from across Scotland and even beyond, but it also commissions research projects which are directly aimed at addressing a particular policy issue. One example of a project that Climate Exchange did recently in response to the COVID-19 pandemic was a project that was commissioned by Transport Scotland. And what they wanted to understand better was how people had changed their work-related travel behaviour in response to the pandemic. And the researchers looked at travel behaviour before the pandemic, during the pandemic itself, and then asked employers about what their plans were for after the pandemic. What it found was a big switch away from public transport and from things like car sharing. So that's an issue in terms of climate exchange and promoting a more sustainable use of travel. So one of the recommendations was to think about new types of schemes like park and stride. So these are new approaches which involve active travel and will hopefully again get people out of single-use cars. So this particular project fed in a lot of policy recommendations which will feed into Scottish Government plans for net zero. The Scottish Government has made a commitment to explore the potential of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And this is the idea that everybody should be able to access all of their needs within a 20-minute walk from their place of residence. So what the Climate Exchange Research Project found was that the physical infrastructure and the pattern of settlements in Scotland at the moment does support this idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And that's true not just in urban parts of Scotland, but across rural Scotland too. So in principle, it's a great idea for Scotland to follow to achieve all of these benefits. So Scotland has very ambitious climate change plans, and it's done incredibly well in terms of renewable electricity generation already. The next set of challenges relate to buildings, heating, transport, our land use sectors. So there's lots of issues that still remain, and each of us has a role to play in supporting that transition.
Plants, and therefore plant health, touch every aspect of our lives. All the way from food, over 95% of the food we eat is plant-based, and the meat that we eat are fed on plants. We have all the managed and natural forests, we have woodlands and parks and all the plants in our gardens, and then we have the natural environment and the biodiversity within that. So if we have plants, then potentially we have problems with plant pests, and that's why the Plant Health Centre is playing such an important role. Scotland's Plant Health Centre is a virtual centre involving about 10 different organisations run by the James Hutton Institute, and it's a conduit by which Scottish Government, organisations and industry can get plant health information, so they can come to us with a particular request and we can then go and find the information they need and bring it back to them. And that can be useful for things like knowing how to deal with different pests and diseases on a farm, all the way through to government contingency planning for new pests and diseases coming into Scotland. A good example of a critical issue that the Plant Health Centre has been dealing with is one about an organism called potato cyst nematode, or PCN. So the nematode attacks the root system and it can actually greatly reduce yield. But more importantly, if you have potato cyst nematode in your soil, it means you can't plant seed potatoes. So it's right at the start of the potato production chain, and so it's really important that we deal with this problem as quickly as possible. Financially, it's already costing the industry about £25 million a year in lost seed production. It's predicted to increase in the next 20 years to 125 million, and there's even a possibility that in 30 years there won't be a seed industry left. Scotland's Plant Health Centre deals with a number of climate change issues. One thing that we're trying to do is to develop models that will better predict whether pests and diseases are going to cause problems in the future because of climate change. One example is an organism called Xylella fastidiosa, which is causing huge problems in Italy on olive trees at the moment, and that's a warmer climate pathogen. But it's very critical now that we make sure it doesn't come into Scotland. This organism can cause disease on many hundreds of different plants, things in the garden like lavender, all the way up to iconic oak trees, so it's really important that we keep it out. Society's changed a lot recently in terms of crop production, because formerly where we were looking for focusing on yield, and we were using chemicals to ensure that we got that yield, chemicals to control pests and diseases. Now we're looking at much more sustainable farming practices, which means that we have to find new ways to control these pests and diseases through methods like integrated pest management, better resistance in our crops, etc. So the Plant Health Centre has a very important role to play in that.
Human health and animal health are inextricably linked. Probably most importantly and most obviously that we get lots of our food from animals. So our centre of expertise is called EPIC, and that is a centre of expertise in animal disease outbreaks. So it pretty much does what it says on the tin. It exists to advise Scottish Government about animal disease outbreaks. The key bit about it though is it is a rapid response unit. It stands at readiness to advise the government in the event of unexpected crises. And that's a really key component of what we do. It's quite unusual for a research organisation to do that. We also conduct longer term research, but we need to be ready to and agile to respond whenever there's a request to do so.
So if an animal disease outbreak happens, such as foot and mouth disease, it's really important to control disease spread as quickly as possible. One of the ways that we use to do that is to put movement restrictions in place. So for example, preventing animals from moving between locations or preventing movements of animal products. So a recent example of where EPIC's work on veterinary risk assessment has helped Scottish Government to make decisions about disease control policy would be the outbreaks of avian influenza that happened as a result of the risk of transmission of bird flu from wild birds to domestic birds. There was a need to put in a housing order. So a housing order would put restrictions in place in terms of keeping birds indoors or protected from contact with wild birds to make sure that transmission can't occur between wild birds and domestic poultry.
Well, it's very difficult to predict precisely how climate change will affect animal health and welfare in the future. Certainly as temperatures increase, if they do, and humidity changes, then it's possible that some of the things that transmit animal diseases, such as midges, ticks, will find new places and new niches and may be able to transmit diseases that currently don't thrive there.
So increases in temperature in Scotland are likely to lead to a change in the diseases that we see. So that could be some diseases may spread more easily within Scotland, and it's also possible we would see increased risk of spread of diseases like blue tongue disease. Blue tongue disease is a virus which is carried by a midge vector. It can infect various species, including cattle and sheep, but particularly causes clinical infection in sheep. So it is something which have quite significant consequences for the cattle and the sheep industry in Scotland.
EPIC work is brilliant because we have a really close relationship with the policy people we work with. So the consequences of animal disease outbreaks in Scotland are potentially drastic because there are a lot of diseases that we strive really hard to keep out of the country, and we're very successful at doing that. But should they arrive here, they would transmit very quickly and could result in huge losses in terms of animal death, poor animal welfare, and disruption to the food production system and the economy.
So the water cycle is the most important Earth system process on the planet. It affects all of our lives, at every stage of our lives, and in every corner of the globe. It's quite simple. Without water, there is no life. CREW, the Centre of Expertise for Waters, provides a boundary organisation that draws knowledge from the research community and helps support policy. By doing that, we really try and ensure that we get the right information to the right people at the right time and in the right way. So most recently, CREW was involved in resourcing and managing investigations into the use of wastewater in our battle against COVID.
We weren't expecting a global pandemic, but CREW had already been working with the different stakeholders in the water research, water industry. So those relationships, research funding was already present in the community. So when the crisis arose, it was possible very quickly for a researcher at the University of Edinburgh's Roslin Institute to develop a test for the COVID virus in wastewater, to use samples from Scottish water, to apply that test and develop it. Scottish Government's wastewater monitoring programme has been able to test the level of COVID-19 virus across the country in wastewater treatment plants. Without that early engagement, without the established connections across the research ecosystem, we could never have started that national programme so quickly.
For many, water is the messenger of climate change. We still have the same amount of water on the planet that we've always had, but it's the distribution in space and time that is our biggest issue. For many, we see pictures of too much water, too little water, and that's become the new norm. So we need to understand the dynamics of the flood and drought processes and how that affects our communities. As water flows through our landscape, we can use different techniques to slow the flow and try and protect our cities and infrastructure. That includes novel ways of looking at managing our rural landscapes and working with farmers and foresters, but also working with urban planners to provide resilience in our cities and towns to the potential consequences of flooding. So CREW supports the Scottish Government in its journey towards becoming a hydro nation. That's a vision for Scotland as a world leader in water research and in water management. So we need to refresh our relationship with water, be it in our rivers and streams, be it in the taps in our homes, or in the waste streams that we produce. We need to remember that every drop is precious. Truly valuing water means giving it the appropriate recognition, promoting efficient and wise use, and balancing our short-term needs against securing a sustainable legacy for the future.